Ahoy again, it's me, Ron Gabaldon, audiobook narrateur. Welcome to part 5 of Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. By now, you have had to sit through a lot of the interrogation and the kind of panel-style firing of Eugene Debs Hartke by the Board of Regents of Tarkington College, and all of the evidence presented against him, and his interrogation by Jason Wilder, the conservative personality, television personality. Geez. Really, does it ever end? It just seems like it never ends, right? I hope you're getting, you have to, right? You have to understand how the times we're living in mirror this, like this book mirrors the times we're living in so much. Anyway, this is part 5 of Hocus Pocus. Let's see. So in part 4, you've also seen more of the Black Cat Cafe, met Lyle Hooper, the owner of the Black Cat Cafe, down in the town of Scipio, and how he got his job at the Athena prison after being fired by Tarkington College. Otherwise, enjoy yourself and enjoy part 5. Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 5, Chapters 25 through 32. Read by Ron Gabaldon. 25. My lawyer found only one thing really interesting in my theory about the Lilac Queen, and that was about the broad purple hair ribbons worn by all the girls in that foot race, right up to the last race before the prison break. The escaped convicts discovered spools and spools of that ribbon in a closet in the office of the Dean of Women. Alton Darwin had them cut it up into armbands as a sort of uniform, a quick way to tell friend from foe. Of course, skin color already did a pretty good job of that. The significance of the purple armbands, my lawyer says, is that I never put one on. This would help to prove that I was truly neutral. The convicts didn't create a new flag. They flew the Stars and Stripes from the bell tower. Alton Darwin said they weren't against America. He said, "We are America." So, I took my leave of Pamela Ford Hall on the afternoon Tarkington fired me. I would never see her again. The only real favor I ever did for her, I suppose, was to tell her to get a second opinion before letting Whitey Van Arsdale sell her a new transmission. She did that, I heard, and it turned out that her old transmission was perfectly okay. It and the rest of the car took her all the way down to Key West, where the former writer-in-residence Paul Slazenger had settled in, living well on his genius grant from the MacArthur Foundation. I hadn't realized that he and she had been an item when they were both at Tarkington, but I guess they were. She certainly never told me about it. At any rate, when I was working over at Athena, I got an announcement of their impending wedding down there, forwarded from Scipio. But evidently that fell through. I imagine her drinking and her insistence on pursuing an art career, even though she wasn't talented, frightened the old novelist. Slazenger was no prize himself, of course. After the prison break, I told Griot, trademark, here, all I knew about Pamela, and asked it to guess what might become of her after her breakup with Paul Slazenger. Griot, trademark, had her die of cirrhosis of the liver. I gave the machine the same set of facts a second time, and it had her freezing to death in a doorway in Chicago. The prognosis was not good. After leaving Pamela, whose basic problem wasn't me but alcohol, I started to climb Musket Mountain, intending to think things out under the water tower. But I was met by Zuzu Jackson, who was coming down. She said she had been under the water tower for hours, trying to think up dreams to replace those we had of running off to Venice. She said that maybe she would run off to Venice alone and take Polaroid pictures of tourists getting in and out of gondolas. The prognosis for her was a lot better than for Pamela, short term anyway. At least she wasn't an addict, and at least she wasn't all alone in the world, even if all she had was Tex. And at least she hadn't been held up as an object of public ridicule from coast to coast. And she could see the humorous side of things. She said, I remember, that the loss of the Venice dream had left her a walking corpse, but that a zombie was an ideal mate for a college president. She went on like that for a little while, but she didn't cry, and she ran out of steam pretty quick. The last thing she said was that she didn't blame me. "I take full responsibility," she said, speaking over her shoulder as she walked away, "for falling in love with such an obvious jerk." Fair enough. I decided not to climb Musket Mountain after all. I went home instead. It would be wiser to think things out in my garage, where other loose cannons from my past were unlikely to interrupt me. But when I got there, I found a man from United Parcel Service ringing the bell. I didn't know him. He was new to town, or he wouldn't have asked why all the blinds were drawn. Anybody who had been in Scipio any length of time knew why the blinds were drawn. Crazy people lived in there. I told him somebody was sick in there and asked what I could do for him. He said he had this big box for me from St. Louis, Missouri. I said I didn't know anybody from St. Louis, Missouri, and wasn't expecting a big box from anywhere. But he proved to me that it was addressed to me all right, so I said, "Okay, let's see it." It turned out to be my old footlocker from Vietnam, which I had left behind when the excrement hit the air conditioning, when I was ordered to take charge of the evacuation from the roof of the embassy. Its arrival was not a complete surprise. Several months earlier, I had received a notice of its existence in a huge army warehouse that was indeed on the edge of St. Louis, where all sorts of unclaimed personal property of soldiers was stored, stuff ditched on battlefields or whatever. Some idiot must have put my footlocker on one of the last American planes to flee Vietnam, thus depriving the enemy of my razor, my toothbrush, my socks and underwear, and, as it happened, the late Jack Patton's final birthday present to me, a copy of Black Garterbelt. A mere 14 years later, the Army said they had it and asked me if I wanted it. I said, yes. A mere 2 years more went by, and then suddenly here it was at my doorstep. Some glaciers move faster than that. So I had the UPS man help me lug it into the garage. It wasn't very heavy, it was just unwieldy. The Mercedes was parked out front. I hadn't noticed yet that kids from the town had cored it again. All 4 tires were flat again. Cough, cough. The UPS man was really only a boy still. He was so childlike and new to his job that he had to ask me what was inside the box. If the Vietnam War was still going on, I said, it might have been you in there. I meant he might have wound up in a casket. I don't get it, he said. Never mind, I said. I knocked off the lock and hasp with a hammer. I lifted the lid of what was indeed a sort of casket to me. It contained the remains of the soldier I used to be. On top of everything else, lying flat and face up, was that copy of Black Garterbelt. Wow, said the kid. He was awed by the woman on the magazine cover. He might have been an astronaut on his first trip in space. "Have you ever considered being a soldier?" I asked him. "I think you'd make a good one." I never saw him again. He could have been fired soon after that and gone looking for work elsewhere. He certainly wasn't going to last long as a UPS man if he was going to hang around like a kid on Christmas morning until he found out what was inside all the different packages. I stayed in the garage. I didn't want to go into the house. I didn't want to go outdoors again either. So I sat down on my footlocker and read The Protocols of the Elders of Tralfamadore in Black Garterbelt. It was about intelligent threads of energy trillions of light years long. They wanted mortal, self-reproducing life forms to spread out through the universe. So several of them, the elders in the title, held a meeting by intersecting near a planet called Tralfamadore. The author never said why the elders thought the spread of life was such a hot idea. I don't blame him. I can't think of any strong arguments in favor of it. To me, wanting every habitable planet to be inhabited is like wanting everybody to have athlete's foot. The elders agreed at the meeting that the only practical way for life to travel great distances through space was in the form of extremely small and durable plants and animals hitching rides on meteors that ricocheted off their planets. But no germs tough enough to survive a trip like that had yet evolved anywhere. Life was too easy for them. They were a bunch of cream puffs. Any creature they infected, chemically speaking, was as challenging as so much chicken soup. There were people on Earth at the time of the meetings, but they were just more hot slop for the germs to swim in. But they had extra-large brains, and some of them could talk. A few could even read and write. So the elders focused in on them and wondered if people's brains might not invent survival tests for germs, which were truly horrible. They saw in us a potential for chemical evils on a cosmic scale. Nor did we disappoint them. What a story! It so happened, according to this story, that the legend of Adam and Eve was being written down for the first time. A woman was doing it. Until then, that charming bunkum had been passed from generation to generation by word of mouth. The elders let her write down most of the origin myth just the way she had heard it, the way everybody told it, until she got very close to the end. Then they took control of her brain and had her write down something which had never been part of the myth before. It was a speech by God to Adam and Eve, supposedly. This was it, and life would become pure hell for microorganisms soon afterward. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Cough. 26. So, the people on Earth thought they had instructions from the creator of the universe himself to wreck the joint. But they were going at it too slowly to satisfy the elders, so the elders put it into the people's heads that they themselves were the life forms that were supposed to spread out through the universe. This was a preposterous idea, of course. In the words of the nameless author, how could all that meat, needing so much food and water and oxygen, and with bowel movements so enormous, expect to survive a trip of any distance whatsoever through the limitless void of outer space? It was a miracle that such ravenous and cumbersome giants could make a round trip for a six-pack to the nearest grocery store. The elders, incidentally, had given up on influencing the humanoids of Tralfamadore, who were right below where they were meeting. The Tralfamadorians had senses of humor and so knew themselves for the severely limited lunkers, not to say crazy lunkers, they really were. They were immune to the kilovolts of pride the elders jazzed their brain with. They laughed right away when the idea popped up in their heads that they were the glory of the universe and that they were supposed to colonize other planets with their incomparable magnificence. They knew exactly how clumsy and dumb they were, even though they could talk some, and some of them could read and write and do math. One author wrote a series of side-splitting satires about Tralfamadorians arriving on other planets with the intention of spreading enlightenment. But the people here on Earth, being humorless, found the same idea quite acceptable. It appeared to the elders that the people here would believe anything about themselves, no matter how preposterous, as long as it was flattering. To make sure of this, they performed an experiment. They put the idea into Earthlings' heads that the whole universe had been created by one big male animal who looked just like them. He sat on a throne, with a lot of less fancy thrones all around him. When people died, they got to sit on those other thrones forever because they were such close relatives of the Creator. The people down here just ate that up. Another thing the elders liked about Earthlings was that they feared and hated other Earthlings who did not look and talk exactly as they did. They made life a hell for each other as well as for what they called lower animals. They actually thought of strangers as lower animals. So all the elders had to do to ensure that germs were going to experience really hard times was to tell us how to make more effective weapons by studying physics and chemistry. The elders lost no time in doing this. They caused an apple to fall on the head of Isaac Newton. They made young James Watt prick up his ears when his mother's tea kettle sang. The elders made us think that the Creator on the big throne hated strangers as much as we did, and that we would be doing him a big favor if we tried to exterminate them all by any and all means possible. That went over big down here. So, it wasn't long before we had made the deadliest poisons in the universe, and were stinking up the air and water and topsoil. In the words of the author, and I wish I knew his name, germs died by the trillions or failed to reproduce because they could no longer cut the mustard. But a few survived and even flourished, even though almost all other life forms on Earth perished. And when all other life forms vanished, and this planet became as sterile as the moon, they hibernated as virtually indestructible spores, capable of waiting as long as necessary for the next lucky hit by a meteor. Thus, at last, did space travel become truly feasible. If you stop to think about it, what the elders did was based on a sort of trickle-down theory. Usually, when people talk about the trickle-down theory, it has to do with economics. The richer people at the top of a society become, supposedly, the more wealth there is to trickle down to the people below. It never really works out that way, of course, because if there are two things people at the top can't stand, they have to be leakage and overflow. But the elders' scheme of having the misery of higher animals trickle down to microorganisms worked like a dream. There was a lot more to the story than that. The author taught me a new term, which was finale rack. This was apparently from the vocabulary of pyrotechnicians, specialists in loud and bright but otherwise harmless nighttime explosions for climaxes of patriotic holidays. A finale rack was a piece of milled lumber, maybe 3 meters long and 20 centimeters wide and 5 centimeters thick, with all sorts of mortars and rocket launchers nailed to it, linked in series by a single fuse. When it seemed that a fireworks show was over, that was when the master pyrotechnician lit the fuse of the finale rack. That is how the author characterized World War II and the few years that followed it. He called it the finale rack of so-called human progress. If the author was right, that the whole point of life on Earth was to make germs shape up, so that they would be ready to ship out when the time came, then even the greatest human being in history, Shakespeare or Mozart or Lincoln or Voltaire or whoever, was nothing more than a petri dish in the truly grand scheme of things. In the story, the Elders of Tralfamadore were indifferent, to say the least, to all the suffering going on. When 6,000 rebellious slaves were crucified on either side of the Appian Way back in good old 71 BC, the elders would have been delighted if a crucified person had spit into the face of a centurion, giving him pneumonia or TB. If I had to guess when the Protocols of the Elders of Tralfamadore was written, I would have to say a long, long time ago, after World War II, but before the Korean War, which broke out in 1950, when I was 10. There was no mention of Korea as part of the finale rack. There was a lot of talk about making the planet a paradise by killing all the bugs and germs, and generating electricity with atomic energy so cheaply that it wouldn't even be metered, and making it possible for everyone to have an automobile that would make him or her mightier than 200 horses and 3 times faster than a cheetah, and incinerating the other half of the planet in case the people there got the idea that it was their sort of intelligence that was supposed to be exported to the rest of the universe. The story was very likely pirated from some other publication, so the omission of the author's name may have been intentional. What sort of writer, after all, would submit a work of fiction for possible publication in Black Garterbelt? I did not realize at the time how much that story affected me. Reading it was simply a way of putting off for just a little while my looking for another job and another place to live at the age of 51, with 2 lunatics in tow. But down deep, the story was beginning to work like a buffered analgesic. What a relief it was, somehow, to have somebody else confirm what I had come to suspect toward the end of the Vietnam War, and particularly after I saw the head of a human being pillowed in the spilled guts of a water buffalo on the edge of a Cambodian village. That humanity is going somewhere really nice was a myth for children under 6 years old, like the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. Cough. I'll tell you one germ that's ready to take off for the Belt of Orion, or the handle on the Big Dipper, or whatever right now, somewhere on Earth, and that's the gonorrhea I brought home from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, back in 1967. For a while there, it looked like I was going to have it for the rest of my life. By now, it probably can eat broken glass and razor blades. The TB germs, which made me cough so much now, though, are pussycats. There are several drugs on the market which they have never learned to handle. The most potent of these was ordered for me weeks ago, and should be arriving from Rochester at any time. If any of my germs are thinking of themselves as space cadets, they can forget it. They aren't going anywhere but down the toilet. Bon voyage! But listen to this. You know the 2 lists I've been working on? One of the women I've made love to, and one of the men, women, and children I've killed? It is becoming ever clearer that the lengths of the lists will be virtually identical. What a coincidence! When I started out with my list of lovers, I thought that however many of them there were might serve as my epitaph, a number and nothing more. But by golly, if that same number couldn't stand for the people I've killed. There's another miracle on the order of Tarkington's students being on vacation during the diphtheria epidemic, and then again during the prison break. How much longer can I go on being an atheist? There are more things in heaven and earth. 27. Here is how I got a job at the prison across the lake on the same day Tarkington College fired me. I came out of the garage, having read that germs, not people, were the darlings of the universe. I got into my Mercedes, intending to go down to the Black Cat Cafe to pick up gossip, if I could, about anybody who was hiring anybody to do practically any kind of work anywhere in this valley. But all 4 tires went bloop, bloop, bloop. All 4 tires had been cored by townies the night before. I got out of the Mercedes and realized that I had to urinate. But I didn't want to do it in my own house. I didn't want to talk to the crazy people in there. How is that for excitement? What germ ever lived a life so rich in challenges and opportunities? At least nobody was shooting at me, and I wasn't wanted by the police. So I went into the tall weeds of a vacant lot across the street from and below my house, which was built on a slope. I whipped out my ding-dong and found it was aimed down at a beautiful white Italian racing bicycle lying on its side. The bicycle was so full of magic and innocence hiding there. It might have been a unicorn. After urinating elsewhere, I set that perfect artificial animal upright. It was brand new. It had a seat like a banana. Why had somebody thrown it away? To this day, I do not know. Despite our enormous brains and jam-packed libraries, we germ hotels cannot expect to understand absolutely everything. My guess is that some kid from a poor family in the town below came across it while skulking around the campus. He assumed, as would I, that it belonged to some Tarkington student who was super rich, who probably had an expensive car and more beautiful clothes than he could ever wear. So he took it, as would I when my turn came. But he lost his nerve, as I would not, and hid it in the weeds rather than face arrest for grand larceny. As I would soon find out the hard way, the bike actually belonged to a poor person, a teenage boy who worked in the stable after school, who scrimped and saved until he could afford to buy as splendid a bicycle as had ever been seen on the campus of Tarkington. To play with my mistaken scenario of the bikes belonging to a rich kid, it seemed possible to me that some rich kid had so many expensive playthings that he couldn't be bothered with taking care of this one. Maybe it wouldn't fit into the trunk of his Ferrari Gran Turismo. You wouldn't believe all the treasures, diamond earrings, Rolex watches, and on, that wound up unclaimed in the college's lost and found. Do I resent rich people? No. The best or worst I can do is notice them. I agree with the great socialist writer George Orwell, who felt that rich people were poor people with money. I would discover this to be the majority opinion in the prison across the lake as well, although nobody over there had ever heard of George Orwell. Many of the inmates themselves had been poor people with money before they were caught, with the most costly cars and jewelry and watches and clothes. Many, as teenage drug dealers, had no doubt owned bicycles as desirable as the one I found in the weeds in the highlands of Scipio. When convicts found out that my car was nothing but a 4-door, 6-cylinder Mercedes, they often scorned or pitied me. It was the same with many of the students at Tarkington. I might as well have owned a battered pickup truck. So I walked that bicycle out of the weeds and onto the steep slope of Clinton Street. I wouldn't have to pedal or turn a corner in order to deliver myself to the front door of the Black Cat Cafe. I would have to use the brakes, however, and I tested those. If the brakes didn't work, I would go off the end of the dock at the old barge terminal and alley-oop straight into Lake Mohiga. I straddled the banana-shaped saddle, which turned out to be surprisingly considerate of my sensitive crotch and hindquarters. Sailing down a hill on that bicycle in the sunshine wasn't anything like being crucified. I parked the bike in plain view in front of the Black Cat Cafe, noting several champagne corks on the sidewalk and in the gutter. In Vietnam, they would have been cartridge cases. This was where Arthur K. Clarke had formed up his motorcycle gang for its unopposed assault on Tarkington. The troops and their ladies had first drunk champagne. There were also remains of sandwiches, and I stepped on one, which I think was either cucumber or watercress. I scraped it off on the curbing, left it there for germs. I'll tell you this, though. No germ is ever going to leave the solar system eating sissy stuff like that. Plutonium! Now there's the stuff to put hair on a microbe's chest. I entered the Black Cat Cafe for the first time in my life. This was my club now, since I had been busted down to townie. Maybe, after a few drinks, I'd go back up the hill and let air out of the tires of some of Clark's motorcycles and limousines. I bellied up to the bar and said, "Give me a wop." That was what I heard people down in the town called Budweiser beer ever since Italians had bought Anheuser-Busch, the company that made Budweiser. The Italians got the St. Louis Cardinals, too, as part of the deal. "Wop coming up," said the barmaid. She was just the kind of woman I would go for right now, if I didn't have TB. She was in her late 30s and had had a lot of bad luck recently and didn't know where to turn next. I knew her story. So did everybody else in town. She and her husband restored an old-time ice cream parlor 2 doors up Clinton Street from the Black Cat Cafe. But then her husband died because he had inhaled so much paint remover. The germs inside him couldn't have felt too great either. Who knows, though? The Elders of Tralfamadore may have had her husband restore the ice cream parlor just so we could have a new strain of germs capable of surviving a passage through a cloud of paint remover in outer space. Her name was Mariel Peck, and her husband, Jerry Peck, was a direct descendant of the first president of Tarkington College. His father grew up in this valley, but Jerry was raised in San Diego, California, and then he went to work for an ice cream company out there. The ice cream company was bought by President Mobutu of Zaire, and Jerry was let go. So he came here with Muriel and their 2 kids to discover his roots. Since he already knew ice cream, it made perfect sense for him to buy the old ice cream parlor. It would have been better for all concerned if he had known a little less about ice cream and a little more about paint remover. Muriel and I would eventually become lovers, but not until I had been working at Athena prison for 2 weeks. I finally got the nerve to ask her, since she and Jerry had both majored in literature at Swarthmore College, if either of them had ever taken the time to read a label on a can of paint remover. "Not until it was much too late," she said. Over at the prison, I would encounter a surprising number of convicts who had been damaged not by paint remover, but by paint. When they were little, they had eaten chips or breathed dust from old lead-based paint. Lead poisoning had made them very stupid. They were all in prison for the dumbest crimes imaginable, and I was never able to teach any of them to read and write. Thanks to them, do we now have germs which eat lead? I know we have germs which eat petroleum. What their story is, I do not know. Maybe they're that Honduran gonorrhea. 28. Jerry Peck was in a wheelchair with a tank of oxygen in his lap at the grand opening of the Mohiga Ice Cream Emporium. But he and Muriel had a nice little hit on their hands. Tarkingtonians and townies alike were pleased by the decor and the luscious ice cream. After the place had been open for only 6 months, though, a man came in and photographed everything. Then he pulled out a tape and made measurements which he wrote down in a book. The Pecks were flattered and asked him if he was from an architectural magazine or what. He said that he worked for the architect who was designing the new student recreation center up on the hill, the Pahlavi Pavilion. The Pahlavis wanted it to have an ice cream parlor identical to theirs, right down to the last detail. So maybe it wasn't paint remover that killed Jerry Peck after all. The pavilion also put the valley's only bowling alley out of business. It couldn't survive on the business of townies alone. So anybody in this area who wanted to bowl and wasn't connected to Tarkington had to go 30 kilometers to the north, to the alleys next to the Meadowdale Cinema Complex, across the highway from the National Guard Armory. It was a slow time of day at the Black Cat Cafe. There may have been a few prostitutes in vans in the parking lot out back, but none inside. The owner, Lyle Hooper, who was also chief of the volunteer fire department and a notary, was at the other end of the bar, doing some kind of bookkeeping. Until the very end of his life, he would never admit that the availability of prostitutes in his parking lot accounted in large measure for the business he did in liquor and snacks, and for the condom machine in the men's room. To the Elders of Tralfamadore, of course, that condom machine would represent a threat to their space program. Lyle Hooper surely knew about my sexual exploits, since he had notarized the affidavits in my portfolio. But he had never mentioned them to me, or, so far as I know, to anyone. He was the soul of discretion. Lyle was probably the best-liked man in this valley. Townies were so fond of him, men and women alike, that I never heard one call the Black Cat Cafe a whorehouse. Up on the hill, of course, it was called almost nothing else. The townies protected the image he had of himself, in spite of police raids and visits from the county health department, as a family man who ran a place of refreshment whose success depended entirely on the quality of the drinks and snacks he served. This kindly conspiracy protected Lyle's son, Charlton, as well. Charlton grew to be 2 meters tall and was a New York State High School All-Star basketball center in his senior year at Scipio High School, and all he ever had to say about his father was that he ran a restaurant. Charlton was such a phenomenal basketball player that he was invited to try out for the New York Knickerbockers, which were still owned by Americans back then. He accepted a full scholarship to MIT instead, and became a top scientist running the huge subatomic particle accelerator called the Super Collider outside Waxahachie, Texas. As I understand it, the scientists down there forced invisible particles to reveal their secrets by making them go splat on photographic plates. That isn't all that different from the way we treated suspected enemy agents in Vietnam sometimes. Have I already said that I threw one out of a helicopter? The townies didn't have to protect the sensibility of Lyle's wife by never saying why the Black Cat Cafe was so prosperous. She had left him. She discovered in midlife that she was a lesbian and ran off with the high school's girls' gym teacher to Bermuda, where they gave, and probably still give, sailing lessons. I made a pass at her one time at an annual town and gown mixer up on the hill. I knew she was a lesbian before she did. At the very end of his life 2 years ago, though, when Lyle Hooper was a prisoner of the escaped convicts up in the bell tower, he was addressed by his captors as Pimp. It was, "Hey Pimp, how do you like the view?" and "What do you think we ought to do with you, Pimp?" and so on. It was cold and wet up there. Snow or rain blown into the belfry fell down through a myriad of bullet holes in the ceiling. Those had been made from below by escaped convicts when they realized that a sniper was up there among the bells. There was no electricity. All electric and telephone service had been shut off. When I visited Lyle up there, he knew the story of those holes. He knew the sniper had been crucified in the stable loft. He knew that the escaped convicts hadn't decided yet what to do with him. He knew that he had committed what was in their eyes murder pure and simple. He and Whitey Van Arsdale had ambushed and killed 3 escaped convicts who were on their way up the old towpath to the head of the lake to negotiate with the police and politicians and soldiers at the roadblock there. The would-be negotiators were carrying flags of truce, white pillowcases on broomsticks, when Lyle Hooper and Whitey Van Arsdale shot them dead. And then Whitey was himself shot dead almost immediately, but Lyle was taken prisoner. But what bothered Hooper most when I talked to him up in the bell tower was that his captors called him nothing but pimp. At this point in my story, and in order to simplify the telling and not to make any political point, let me from now on call the escaped convicts in Scipio what they called themselves, which was freedom fighters. So Lyle Hooper was without question responsible for the death of 3 freedom fighters carrying flags of truce. The freedom fighter who was guarding him in the tower when I came to see him, moreover, was the half-brother and former partner in the crack business, along with their grandmother, of one of the freedom fighters he or Whitey had killed. But all Lyle could talk about was the pain of being called a pimp. To many, if not most of the freedom fighters, of course, it was no particular insult to call someone a pimp. Lyle told me that he had been raised by his paternal grandmother, who made him promise to leave the world a better place than when he found it. He said, "Have I done that, Gene?" I said he had. Since he was facing execution, I certainly wasn't going to tell him that, in my experience anyway, ambushes made the world seem an even worse place than it was before. "I ran a nice clean place. Raised a wonderful son," he said. "Put out a lot of fires." It was the trustees who told the freedom fighters that Lyle ran a whorehouse. Otherwise, they would have thought he was just a restaurateur and fire chief. Lyle Hooper's mood up there in the bell tower reminded me of my father's mood after he was let go by Barrytron. And he went on a cruise down the inland waterway on the East Coast from City Island in New York City to Palm Beach, Florida. This was on a motor yacht owned by his old college roommate, a man named Fred Handy. Handy had also studied chemical engineering, but then had gone into junk bonds instead. He heard that Father was deeply depressed. He thought the cruise might cheer Dad up. But all the way to Palm Beach, where Handy had a waterfront estate, down the East River, down Vonnegut Bay, up Delaware Bay, and down Chesapeake Bay, down the dismal Swamp Canal, and on, the yacht had to nuzzle its way through a shore-to-shore, horizon-to-horizon carpet of bobbing plastic bottles. They had contained brake fluid and laundry bleach, and so on. Father had had a lot to do with the development of those bottles. He knew, too, that they could go on bobbing for 1,000 years. They were nothing to be proud of. In a way, those bottles called him what the freedom fighters called Lyle Hooper. Lyle's despairing last words as he was led out of the bell tower to be executed in front of Somoza Hall might be an apt epitaph for my father. Okay, I admit it. It really was a whorehouse. 29. Lyle Hooper's last words, I think we can say with the benefit of hindsight in the year 2001, might serve as an apt epitaph for the plurality of working adults in industrialized nations during the 20th century. How could they help themselves when so many of the jobs they or their mates could get had to do with large-scale deceptions, legal thefts from public treasuries, or the wrecking of the food chain, the topsoil, the water, or the atmosphere? After Lyle Hooper was executed with a bullet behind the ear, I visited the trustees in the stable. Tex Johnson was still spiked to the cross timbers in the loft overhead, and they knew it. But before I tell about that, I had better finish my story of how I got a job at Athena. So there I was back in 1991, nursing a Budweiser, or WAP, at the bar of the Black Cat Cafe. Muriel Peck was telling me how exciting it had been to see all the motorcycles and limousines and celebrities out front. She couldn't believe that she had been that close to Gloria White and Henry Kissinger. Several of the merry roisterers had come inside to use the toilet or get a drink of water. Arthur K. Clarke had provided everything but water and toilets. So Muriel had dared to ask some of them who they were and what they did. 3 of the people were black. One black was an old woman who had just won $57 million in the New York State Lottery. And the other 2 were baseball players who made $3 million a year. A white man who kept apart from the rest and, according to Muriel, didn't seem to know what to make of himself, was a daily book reviewer for the New York Times. He had given a rare review to Clarke's autobiography, Don't Be Ashamed of Money. One man who came in to use the toilet, she said, was the famous author of horror stories that had been made into some of the most popular movies of all time. I had in fact read a couple of them in Vietnam, about innocent people getting murdered by walking corpses with axes and knives and so on. I passed one of them on to Jack Patton, I remember, and asked him later what he thought of it. And then I stopped him from answering, saying, "You don't have to tell me, Jack. I already know. It made you want to laugh like hell." "Not only that, Major Hartke," he replied. "I thought of what his next book should be about." "What's that?" I asked. "A B-52, he said. Gore and guts everywhere." One user of the toilet, who confessed to Muriel that he had diarrhea and asked if she had anything behind the bar to stop it, was a retired astronaut whom she recognized but couldn't name. She had seen him again and again in commercials for a sinus headache remedy and a retirement community in Cocoa Beach, Florida, near Cape Kennedy. So Arthur K. Clarke, along with all his other activities, was a whimsical people collector. He invited people he didn't really know, but who had caught his eye for one reason or another, to his parties, and they came. Another one, Muriel told me, was a man who had inherited from his father a painting by Mark Rothko that had just been sold to the Getty Museum in Malibu, California for $37 million, a new record for a painting by an American. Rothko himself had long since committed suicide. He had had enough. He was out of here. "She's so short," Muriel said to me. "I was so surprised how short she was." "Who's so short?" I said. "Gloria White," she said. I asked her what she thought of Henry Kissinger. She said she loved his voice. I had seen him up on the quadrangle. Although I had been an instrument of his geopolitics, I felt no connection between him and me. His face was certainly familiar. He might have been, like Gloria White, somebody who had been in a lot of movies I had seen. I dreamed about him once here in prison, though. He was a woman. He was a gypsy fortune-teller who looked into her crystal ball but wouldn't say anything. I said to Muriel, "You worry me." "I what?" she said. "You look tired," I said. "Did you get enough sleep?" "Yes, thank you," she said. "Forgive me," I said. "None of my business. It's just that you were so full of life while you were talking about the motorcycle people. When you stopped, it was as though you took off a mask, and you seemed as though you were suddenly all wrung out." Muriel knew vaguely who I was. She had seen me with Margaret and Mildred in tow at least twice a week during the short time the ice cream parlor was in business. So I did not have to tell her that I, too, practically speaking, was without a mate. And she had seen with her own eyes how kind and patient I was with my worse-than-useless relatives. So she was already favorably disposed to me. She trusted me and responded with undisguised gratitude to my expressions of concern for her happiness. "If you want to know the truth," she said, "I hardly sleep at all. I worry so much about the children." She had 2 of them. "The way things are going," she said, "I don't see how I can afford to send even one of them to college. I'm from a family where everybody went to college and never thought a thing about it. But that's all over now. Neither one is an athlete." We might have become lovers that night, I think, instead of 2 weeks from then, if an ugly mountain of a man hadn't entered raging, demanding to know, "All right, where is he? Where's that kid?" He was asking about the kid who worked at Tarkington's stable after school, whose bicycle I had stolen. I had left the kid's bike in plain view out front. Every other place of business on Clinton Street was boarded up, from the barge terminal to halfway up the hill. So the only place the boy could be, he thought, was inside the Black Cat Cafe, or worse, inside one of the vans out back in the parking lot. I played dumb. We went outside with him to find out what bicycle he could possibly be talking about. I offered him the theory that the boy was a good boy and nowhere near the Black Cat Cafe, and that some bad person had borrowed the bike and left it there. So he put the bike on the back of his beat-up pickup truck and said he was late for an appointment for a job interview at the prison across the lake. "What kind of a job?" I asked. And he said, "They're hiring teachers over there." I asked if I could come with him. He said, "Not if you're going to teach what I want to teach. What are you going to teach?" "Anything you don't want to teach," I said. "I want to teach shop," he said. "You want to teach shop?" "No," I said. "Word of honor?" he said. "Word of honor," I said. "Okay," he said. "Get in, get in." 30. To understand how the lower ranks of guards at Athena in those days felt about white people, and never mind black people, you have to realize that most of them were recruited from Japan's northernmost island, Hokkaido. On Hokkaido, the primitive natives, the Ainus, thought to be very ugly because they were so pallid and hairy, were white people. Genetically speaking, they were just as white as Nancy Reagan. Their ancestors long ago had made the error, when humiliated by superior Asiatic civilizations, of shambling north instead of west to Europe, and eventually, of course, to the Western Hemisphere. Those white people on Hokkaido had sure missed a lot. They were way behind practically everybody. And when a man who wanted to teach shop and I presented ourselves at the gate to the road that led through the national forest to the prison, the 2 guards on duty there were fresh from Hokkaido. For all the respect our being whites inspired in them, we might as well been a couple of drunken, disorderly Arapahoes. The man who wanted to teach shop said his name was John Donner. On the way over, he asked me if I had seen him on the Phil Donahue Show on TV. That was a 1-hour show every weekday afternoon, which featured a small group of real people, not actors, who had had the same sort of bad thing happen to them and had triumphed over it, or were barely coping, or whatever. There were 2 very similar programs in competition with Donahue, and the old novelist Paul Slazenger used to watch all 3 simultaneously, switching back and forth. I asked him why he did that. He said he didn't want to miss the moment when suddenly there was absolutely nothing left to talk about. I told John Donner that, unfortunately, I couldn't watch any of those shows since I taught music appreciation in the afternoon and then martial arts after that. I asked him what his particular Donahue show had been about. "People who were raised in foster homes and got beat up all the time," he said. I would see plenty of Donahue reruns at the prison, but not Donner's. That show would have been Coles to Newcastle at Athena, where practically everybody had been beaten regularly and severely when he was a little kid. I didn't see Donner on TV over there, but I did see myself a couple of times, or somebody who looked a whole lot like me in the distance, on old footage of the Vietnam War. I even yelled one time at the prison, "There I am! There I am!" Convicts gathered behind me, looking at the TV and saying, "Where? Where?" But they were too late. I was gone again. Where did I go? Here I am. 31. John Donner could have been a pathological liar. He could have made that up about being on Donahue. There was something very fishy about him. Then again, he could have been living under the Federal Witness Protection Program, with a new name and a fake biography Griot, trademark, had written out for him. Statistically speaking, Griot, trademark, would have to put it into a biography every so often, I suppose, that the fictitious subject was on Donahue. He claimed that the boy he lived with was his son, but he could have kidnapped that kid whose bike I stole. They had come to town only about 18 months before and kept to themselves. I am sure his last name wasn't Donner. I have known several Donners. One was a year behind me at the academy. 2 were unrelated Tarkingtonians. One was a first sergeant in Vietnam who had his arm blown off by a little boy with a homemade hand grenade. Every one of those Donners knew the story of the infamous Donner Party, which got caught in a blizzard back in 1846 while trying to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains in wagons to get to California. Their wagons were very likely made right here in Scipio. I have just looked up the details in the Encyclopedia Britannica, published in Chicago and owned by a mysterious Egyptian arms dealer living in Switzerland. Rule Britannia. Those who survived the blizzard did so by becoming cannibals. The final tally, and several women and children were eaten, was 47 survivors out of 87 people who had begun the trip. Now there's a subject for Donahue. People who have eaten people. People who can eat people are the luckiest people in the world. But when I asked the man who claimed his last name was Donner if he had any relation to the man who led the Donner Party, he didn't know what I was talking about. Whoever he really was, he and I wound up side by side on a hard bench in the waiting room outside the office of Athena's warden, Hiroshi Matsumoto. While we sat there, incidentally, some supplier to the prison was stealing the bicycle from the back of Donner's pickup truck. A mere detail. Donner told the truth about one thing at least. The warden was ready to interview applicants for a teaching job, but we were the only 2 applicants. Donner said he heard about the job opening on the National Public Radio station in Rochester. That isn't the sort of station people looking for work are likely to listen to. It is much too sophisticated. That was the only area station I know of, incidentally, which said it was tragic, not funny, what happened to Pamela Ford Hall's one-woman show in Buffalo. There was a Japanese TV set in front of us. There were Japanese TV sets all over the prison. They were like portholes in an ocean liner. The passengers were in a state of suspended animation until the big ship got where it was going. But anytime they wanted, the passengers could look through a porthole and see the real world out there. Life was like an ocean liner to a lot of people who weren't in prison too, of course. And their TV sets were portholes through which they could look while doing nothing, to see all the world was doing with no help from them. Look at it go! At Athena, though, the TVs showed nothing but very old shows from a large library of tapes 2 doors down from the office of Warden Matsumoto's office. The tapes weren't played in any particular order. A guard who might not even understand English kept the central VCR stoked with whatever came to hand, just as though the cassettes were charcoal briquettes and the VCR was a hibachi back on Hokkaido. But this whole scheme was an American invention taken over by the Japanese, like the VCR and the TV sets. Back when races were mixed in prisons, the adopted son of a member of the board of directors of the Museum of Broadcasting was sent to Athena for having strangled a girlfriend behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the father had hundreds of tapes of TV shows in the library of the Museum of Broadcasting duplicated and presented to the prison. His dream, apparently, was that the tapes would provide the basis for a course at Athena in broadcasting, which industry some of the inmates might consider entering after they got out, if they ever got out. But the course in broadcasting never materialized. So the tapes were run over and over again as something better than nothing for the convicts to look at while they were serving time. The adopted son of the donor of the tapes came back into the news briefly at the time the prison populations were being segregated according to race. There was talk of paroling him and a lot of others rather than transferring them to other prisons. But the parents of the girl he had murdered behind the museum, who were well connected socially, demanded that he serve his full sentence, which, as I recall it, was 99 years. He was adopted, as I say. It came out that his biological father had also been a murderer. So he now may be on one of the aircraft carriers or missile cruisers in New York Harbor that have been converted into prison ships. While Donner and I waited to see the warden, we watched the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Bingo! The back of his head flew off. His wife, wearing a pillbox hat, crawled out over the trunk of the convertible limousine. And then the show cut to the police station in Dallas as Lee Harvey Oswald, the ex-Marine who supposedly shot the president with a mail-order Italian rifle, was shot in the guts by the owner of a local strip joint. Oswald said, "Ow." There, yet again, was that ow heard round the world. Who says history has to be boring? Meanwhile, out in the prison parking lot, somebody who had delivered food or whatever to the prison was taking the bicycle out of Donner's truck and putting it in his own, and taking off. It was like the murder of the Lilac Queen back in 1922. A perfect crime. Cough. There is even talk now of turning our nuclear submarines into jails for persons who, like myself, are awaiting trial. They wouldn't submerge, of course, and the rocket and torpedo tubes and all the electronic equipment would be sold for junk, leaving more space for cells. If the entire submarine fleet were converted into jails, I've heard, the cells would be filled up at once. When this place stopped being a college and became a prison, it was filled to the brim before you could say Jack Robinson. I was called into the warden's office first. When I came back out with not only a job, but a place to live, the TV set was displaying a program I had watched when I was a boy, Howdy Doody. Buffalo Bob, the host, was about to be sprayed with seltzer water by Clarabelle the Clown. They were in black and white. That's how old that show was. I told Donner the warden wanted to see him, but he didn't seem to know who I was. I felt as though I were trying to wake up a mean drunk. I used to have to do that a lot in Vietnam. A couple of times the mean drunks were generals. The worst was having a visiting congressman. I thought I might have to fight Donner before he realized that Howdy Doody wasn't the main thing going on. Warden Hiroshi Matsumoto was a survivor of the atom bombing of Hiroshima when I was 5 and he was 8. When the bomb was dropped, he was playing soccer during school recess. He chased a ball into a ditch at one end of the playing field. He bent over to pick up the ball. There was a flash and wind. When he straightened up, his city was gone. He was alone on a desert, with little spirals of dust dancing here and there. But I would have to know him for more than 2 years before he told me that. His teachers and schoolmates were executed without trial for the crime of emperor worship. Like St. Joan of Arc, they were burned alive. Crucifixion as a mode of execution for the very worst criminals was outlawed by the first Christian Roman emperor, who was Constantine the Great. Burning and boiling were still okay. If I had more time to think about it, I might not have applied for a job at Athena, realizing that I would have had to admit that I served in Vietnam, killing or trying to kill nothing but Orientals, and my interviewer would surely be Oriental. Yes, and no sooner did Warden Matsumoto hear that I was a West Pointer than he said with terrible heaviness, "Then, of course you spent time in Vietnam." I thought to myself, uh-oh, there goes the ball game. I misread him completely, not knowing then that the Japanese considered themselves to be as genetically discrete from other Orientals as from me or Donner or Nancy Reagan or the pallid, hairy Ainus, say. "A soldier does what he is ordered to do," I said. I never felt good about what I had to do. This wasn't entirely true. I had gotten high as a kite on the fighting now and then. I actually killed a man with my bare hands one time. He had tried to kill me. I barked like a dog and laughed afterwards. And then I threw up. My confession that I had served in Vietnam, to my amazement, made Warden Matsumoto feel that we were almost brothers. He came out from behind his desk to take me by the hand and stare into my eyes. It was an odd experience for me, simply from the physical standpoint, since he was wearing a surgical mask and rubber gloves. "So, we both know what it is," he said, "to be shipped to an alien land on a dangerous mission of vainglorious lunacy." 32. What an afternoon! Only 3 hours before, I had been so at peace in my bell tower. Now I was inside a maximum security prison with a masked and gloved Japanese national who insisted that the United States was his Vietnam. What is more, he had been in the middle of student anti-war protests over here when the Vietnam War was going on. His corporation had sent him to the Harvard Business School to study the minds of the movers and shakers who were screwing up our economy for their own immediate benefit, taking money earmarked for research and development and new machinery and so on, and putting it into monumental retirement plans and year-end bonuses for themselves. During our interview, he used all the anti-war rhetoric he had heard at Harvard in the 60s to denounce his own country's overseas disaster. We were a quagmire. There was no light at the end of the tunnel over here, and on and on. Until that moment, I had not given a thought to the mental state of members of the ever-growing army of Japanese nationals in this country, who had had to make a financial go of all the properties their corporations had bought out from under us. And it really must have felt to most of them like a war overseas about heaven knows what. And especially since, as was my case in Vietnam, they were color-coded in contrast with the majority of the native population. On the subject of color coding, you might have expected that a lot of black people would be shot after the prison break, even though they weren't escaped convicts. The state of mind of whites in this valley certainly was that any black male had to be an escapee. Shoot first and ask questions afterward. I was sure used to that. But the only person who wasn't an escapee who got shot just for being black was the nephew of the mayor of Troy, and he was only winged. He lost the use of his right hand, but that has since been repaired by the miracle of microsurgery. He was left-handed anyway. He was winged when he was where he wasn't supposed to be, where nobody of any race was supposed to be. He was camping in the national forest, which is against the law. He didn't even know there had been a prison break. And then, bang! And here I am capitalizing black and white sometimes, and then not capitalizing them, and not feeling right about how the words look either way. That could be because sometimes race seems to matter a tremendous lot, and other times race seems to matter a little less than that. I keep wanting to say so-called black or so-called black. My guess is that well over half the inmates at Athena, and now in this prison here, had white or white ancestors. Many appear to be mostly white, but they get no credit for that. Imagine what that must feel like. I myself have claimed a black ancestor, since this is a prison for blacks only, and I don't want to be transferred out of here. I need this library. You can imagine what sorts of libraries they must have on the aircraft carriers and missile cruisers which have been converted into prison ships. This is home. My lawyer says I am smart not to want to be transferred, but for other reasons. A transfer might put me back in the news again and raise a popular clamor for my punishment. As matters stand now, I am forgotten by the general public, and so, for that matter, is the prison break. The break was big news on TV for only about 10 days. And then it was displaced as a headliner by a lone white girl. She was the daughter of a gun nut in rural Northern California. She wiped out the prom committee of her high school with a Chinese hand grenade from World War II. Her father had one of the world's most complete collection of hand grenades. Now his collection isn't as complete as it used to be, unless, of course, he had more than one Chinese hand grenade from the finale rack. Warden Matsumoto became chattier and chattier during my job interview. Before he was sent to Athena, he said, he ran a hospital for profit his corporation had bought in Louisville. He loved the Kentucky Derby, but he hated his job. I told him I used to go to the horse races in Saigon every chance I got. He said, "I only wish our chairman of the board back in Tokyo could have spent just 1 hour with me in our emergency room, turning away dying people because they could not afford our services. You had a body count in Vietnam, I believe?" It was true. We were ordered to count how many people we killed so that higher headquarters, all the way back to Washington, D.C., could estimate how much closer, even if it was only a teeny-weeny bit closer, all our efforts were bringing us to victory. There wasn't any other way to keep score. "So, now we count dollars the way we used to count bodies," he said. What does that bring us closer to? What does it mean? We should do with those dollars what you did with the bodies. Bury and forget them. You were luckier with your bodies than we are with all our dollars. How so? I said. All anybody can do with bodies is burn them or bury them, he said. There isn't any nightmare afterwards when you have to invest them and make them grow. What a clever trap your ruling class has set for us, he went on. First the atomic bomb, now this. Trap? I echoed wonderingly. They looted your public and corporate treasuries and turned your industries over to nincompoops, he said. Then they had your government borrow so heavily from us that we had no choice but to send over an army of occupation in business suits. Never before has the ruling class of a country found a way to stick other countries with all the responsibilities their wealth might imply, and still remain rich beyond the dreams of avarice. No wonder they thought the comatose Ronald Reagan was a great president. His point was well taken, it seems to me. When Jason Wilder and all the rest of the trustees were hostages in the stable and I paid them a call, I got the distinct impression that they regarded Americans as foreigners. What nationality that made them is hard to say. They were all white, and they were all male since Lowell Chung's mother had died of tetanus. She died before the doctors could understand what was killing her. None of them had ever seen a case of tetanus before, because practically everybody in this country in the old days had been immunized. Now that public health programs have pretty much fallen apart, and no foreigners are interested in running them, which is certainly understandable, quite a number of cases of tetanus, and especially among children, are turning up again. So most doctors know what it looks like now. Mrs. Chung had the misfortune to be a pioneer. The hostages told me about that. One of the first things I said to them was, "Where is Madam Chung?" I thought I should reassure the trustees after the execution of Lyle Hooper. His corpse had been shown to them as a warning, I suppose, against their making any plans for daring do. That body was surely icing on the cake of terror, so to speak. The college president, after all, was dangling from spikes in the loft above. One of the hostages said in a TV interview after he was liberated that he would never forget the sound of Tex Johnson's head bouncing on the steps as Tex was dragged up to the loft feet first. He tried to imitate the sound. He said, "Bloomp, bloomp, bloomp," the same sound a flat tire makes. What a planet! The hostages expressed pity for Tex, but none for Lyle Hooper, and none for all the other faculty members and townies who were also dead. The locals were too insignificant for persons on their social level to think about. I don't fault them for this. I think they were being human. The Vietnam War couldn't have gone on as long as it did, certainly, if it hadn't been human nature to regard persons I didn't know and didn't care to know, even if they were in agony, as insignificant. A few human beings have struggled against this most natural of tendencies and have expressed pity for unhappy strangers. But, as history shows, as history yells, they have never been numerous. Another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. And the worst flaw is that we're just plain dumb. Admit it. You think Auschwitz was intelligent? When I tried to tell the hostages a little about their captors and about their childhoods and mental illnesses and their not caring if they lived or died and what prison was like and so on, Jason Wilder actually closed his eyes and covered his ears. He was being theatrical rather than practical. He didn't cover his ears so well that he couldn't hear me. Others shook their heads and indicated in other ways that such information was not only tiresome, but offensive. It was as though we were in a thunderstorm and I had begun lecturing on the circulation of electrical charges in clouds, and the formation of raindrops, and the paths chosen by lightning strokes, and what thunder was, and on and on. All they wanted to know was when the storm would stop, so they could go on about their business. What Warden Matsumoto had said about people like them was accurate. They had managed to convert their wealth, which had originally been in the form of factories or stores or other demanding enterprises, into a form so liquid and abstract, negotiable representations of money on paper, that there were few reminders coming from anywhere that they might be responsible for anyone outside their own circle of friends and relatives. They didn't rage against the convicts. They were mad at the government for not making sure that escapes from prison were impossible. The more they ran on like that, the clearer it became that it was their government, not mine or the convicts or the townies. Its first duty, moreover, was to protect them from the lower classes, not only in this country, but everywhere. Were people on Easy Street ever any different? Think again about the crucifixions of Jesus and the 2 thieves and the 6,000 slaves who followed the gladiator Spartacus. Cough. My body, as I understand it, is attempting to contain the TB germs inside me in little shells it builds around them. The shells are calcium, the most common element in the walls of many prisons, including Athena. This place was ringed by barbed wire. So was Auschwitz. If I die of TB, it will be because my body could not build prisons fast enough and strong enough. Is there a lesson there? Not a cheerful one. If the trustees were bad, the convicts were worse. I would be the last person to say otherwise. They were devastators of their own communities, with gunfights and robberies and rapes, and the merchandising of brain-busting chemicals, and on and on. But at least they saw what they were doing, whereas people like the trustees had a lot in common with B-52 bombardiers way up in the stratosphere. They seldom saw the devastation they caused as they moved the huge portion of this country's wealth they controlled from here to there. Unlike my socialist grandfather Ben Wills, who was a nobody, I have no reforms to propose. I think any form of government, not just capitalism, is whatever the people who have all our money, drunk or sober, sane or insane, decide to do today. Warden Matsumoto was an odd duck. Many of his quirks were no doubt a consequence of his having had an atomic bomb dropped on him in childhood. The buildings and trees and bridges and so on, which had seemed so substantial, vanished like fantasies. As I've said, Hiroshima was suddenly a blank tableland, with little dust devils spinning here and there. After the flash, little Hiroshi Matsumoto was the only real thing on the table. He began a long, long walk in search of anything else that was also real. When he reached the edge of the city, he found himself among structures and creatures both real and fantastic. Living people with their skins hanging on their exposed muscles and bones like draperies, and so on. These images about the bombing were all his, by the way, but I wouldn't hear them from him until I had been teaching at the prison and living next door to him by the lake for 2 long years. Whatever else atom bombed had done to him, it had not destroyed his conscience. He had hated turning away poor people from the emergency room at the hospital for profit he ran in Louisville. After he took over the prison for profit at Athena, He thought there ought to be some sort of educational program there, even though his corporation's contract with New York State required him to keep the prisoners from escaping and nothing more. He worked for Sony. He never worked for anybody but Sony. New York State, he said, does not believe that education can rehabilitate the sort of criminal who ends up at Athena or Attica or Sing Sing. Attica and Sing Sing were for Hispanics and whites respectively, who, like the inmates at Athena, had been convicted of at least one murder and 2 other violent crimes. The other 2 were likely to be murders too. I don't believe it either, he said. I do know this, though. 10% of the people inside these walls still have minds, but there is nothing for those minds to play with. So this place is twice as painful for them as it is for the rest. A good teacher just might be able to give their minds new toys, math or astronomy or history or who knows what, which would make the passage of time just a little bit more bearable. What do you think? You're the boss, I said. He really was the boss, too. He had made such a financial success of Athena that his corporate superiors allowed him to be completely autonomous. They had contracted with the state to take care of prisoners for only 2/3 as much money per capita as the state had spent when it owned the place. That was about as much as it would have cost to send a convict to medical school or Tarkington. By importing cheap, young, short-term, non-union labor, and by getting supplies from the lowest bidders rather than from the mafia and so on, Hiroshi Matsumoto had cut the per capita cost to less than half of what it used to be. He didn't miss a trick. When I went to work for him, he had just bought a state-of-the-art crematorium for the prison. Before that, a mafia-owned crematorium on the outskirts of Rochester, in the back of the Meadowdale Cinema Complex, across the highway from the National Guard Armory, had had a monopoly on cremating Athena's unclaimed bodies. After the Japanese bought Athena, though, the mob doubled their prices, using the AIDS epidemic as an excuse. They had to take extra precautions, they said. They wanted double even if the prison provided a doctor's certificate guaranteeing that the body was AIDS-free, and the cause of death, as anybody could see, was some sort of knife or garrote or blunt instrument. There wasn't a Japanese manufacturer of crematoria, so Warden Matsumoto bought one from A.J. Topf & Son in Essen, Germany. This was the same outfit that made the ovens for Auschwitz in its heyday. The post-war Topf models all had state-of-the-art smoke scrubbers on their smokestacks, so people in Scipio, unlike the people living near Auschwitz, never knew that they had a busy corpse carbonizer in the neighborhood. We could have been gassing and incinerating convicts over there around the clock, and who would know? Who would care? A while back, I mentioned that Lowell Chung's mother died of tetanus. I want to say before I forget that tetanus might have a real future in astronautics, since it becomes an extremely rugged spore when life becomes intolerable. I haven't nominated AIDS viruses as promising intergalactic rock jockeys, since at their present state of development, they can't survive for long outside a living human body. Concerted efforts to kill them with new poisons, though, if only partially successful, could change all that. The Mafia Crematorium behind the Meadowdale Cinema Complex has all this valley's prison business again. Some of the convicts who stayed in or near Athena after the Great Escape, rather than attack Scipio across the ice, felt that at least they could bust up the A.J. Topf & Son crematorium. The Meadowdale Cinema Complex itself has gone belly up, since so few people can afford to own an automobile anymore. Same thing with the shopping malls. One interesting thing to me, although I don't know quite what to make of it, is that the Mafia never sells anything to foreigners. While everybody else who has inherited or built a real business can't wait to sell out and take early retirement, the mafia holds on to everything. Thus, does the paving business, for example, remain a strictly American enterprise. Same thing with wholesale meat and napkins and tablecloths for restaurants. I told the warden right up front that I had been canned by Tarkington. I explained that the charges against me for sexual irregularities were a smokescreen. The trustees were really angry about my having wobbled the students' faith in the intelligence and decency of their country's leadership by telling them the truth about the Vietnam War.
"Nobody on this side of the lake believes there is such a thing in this miserable country,"
he said. "Such a thing as what, sir?" I said. And he said,
"Leadership."
As for my sexual irregularities, he said, they seemed to be uniformly heterosexual, and there were no women on his side of the lake. He himself was a bachelor, and members of his staff were not allowed to bring their wives with them, if they had them.
"So over here," he said, "you would truly be Don Juan in hell. Do you think you could stand that?"
I said I could, so he offered me a job on a trial basis. I would start work as soon as possible, offering general education, mostly on the primary school level, not all that different from what I had done at Tarkington. An immediate problem was housing. His staff lived in barracks in the shadows of the prison walls, and he himself had a renovated house down by the water, and was the only inhabitant of the ghost town, a ghost hamlet, actually, after which the prison was named, Athena. If it didn't work out for some reason, he said, we would still need a teacher on the property who would surely not want to live in the barracks. So he was having another old house in the ghost town made livable, right next to his own. But it wouldn't be ready for occupancy until August.
"Do you think the college will let you stay where you are until then? And meanwhile, you could commute to work from over there. You have a car?"
"A Mercedes," I said.
"Excellent," he said. "That will give you something in common with the inmates right away."
"How so?" I said.
"They're practically all former Mercedes owners," he said.
This was only a slight exaggeration. He told the truth when he said,
"We have one man in here who bought his first Mercedes when he was 15 years old."
That was Alton Darwin, whose dying words on the skating rink after the prison break would be, "See the nigger fly the airplane." So the college did let us stay in the Scipio house over the summer. There was no summer session at Tarkington. Who would have come to one? And I commuted to the prison every day. In the old days, before the Japanese took over Athena, the whole staff was commuters from Scipio and Rochester. They were unionized, and it was their unceasing demands for more and more pay and fringe benefits, including compensation for their travel to and from work, that made the state decide to sell the whole shebang to the Japanese. My salary was what I had been paid by Tarkington. I could keep our Blue Cross Blue Shield, since the corporation that owned the prison also owned Blue Cross Blue Shield. No problem. Cough. That is another thing the prison break cost me. Our Blue Cross Blue Shield.